welcome to the 404 Effect, the podcast that puts Atlanta's most influential voices in the spotlight. I'm your host, Demetrius Thomas, entrepreneur, lifelong ATL resident, and someone who has had the privilege of building businesses in the music, film, and fashion spaces right here in the city that never stops evolving. In every episode, we sit down with the game changers, the innovators, and the trailblazers who are shaping the future of the A. From business, education, and finance to sports entertainment, food, fashion, medicine, and technology. If they are making an impact, we are bringing you their story. So, off to our first guest. We have here, and as a part of my first episode, I had to go real special with this one. Not only is she a 6-year educator in the Gwinnett County school system, she has been awarded Teacher of the Year in 2023. She is an aspiring law student as well currently. But above all of that, it is like I'm so over the top and amped right now because I get to pull my family in to this special moment as we launch this 404 Effect podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, and to the rest of the world, I present to you my blood sister, Lindsay Kate Thomas. Use your whole government name.
Okay.
Y'all put your hands together for my sister, the special educator, Lindsay Kate Thomas, the first guest on our podcast. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
AKA Side Eye Shouty Mom. We'll try to behave.
AKA the president of my fan club. I'm happy to be here.
Checks in the mail. So, thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know, my sister is a special educator in the Gwinnett County school system, which happens to be the largest school system in the state of Georgia.
Yes.
And the 5th largest school system in the country.
Something like that, yes. Right up there.
We'll go with those numbers until our fact checker tells us to correct it in post.
Top 10. Top
10. But with that, in recent news, the school system has been undergoing some leadership changes as far as their school superintendent is concerned. But if you know anything about the public school system in this country, in this state, in this city of Atlanta, there are a lot of complexities, challenges that the teachers have to contend with. So today we're going to talk about a few of those as it relates to the needs of children who have disabilities or require special education services. And we have our subject matter expert here. So let's get straight into it. What are some of the challenges, what are some of the trends that you see as a education teacher?
I think the biggest trend that I've seen is, or that everyone who's paying attention has seen, is that our babies can't read. None of the children can read at this point. We have a big epidemic of a whole generation of kids who are struggling. As far as literacy and reading comprehension is concerned. I read recently that 70% of 12th graders right now have a basic level of reading ability.
So let me get that, make sure I understand it as well as our audience, because that's a staggering statistic. You mean to tell me 70% of exiting high schoolers, seniors, read at a elementary school level?
Yes.
C-spot run?
And what does that even mean? Because reading words is one thing, but comprehending them is where it's really at. So yeah.
Is there a breakdown between the reading and the comprehension, or both? Or
you need to have both to be able to function, really, to be able to do anything. There's a thing called word recall. And that is just being able to look at the words and say them. But if you don't understand what you're reading, that means you're not comprehending. What can you do with that information if you don't understand it? So you can say see Spot run, but if you don't understand who Spot is, what is Spot doing, how can you take that information and use it? And so, yes, there's a bunch of 12th graders who are about to enter the workforce and be out here in the world with us, trying to do things, and they can't understand what they're reading or writing.
And that's where superheroes like you come in to save the day. So that's that's going to be the subject matter of our episode today, what that looks like, not only for the students, not only for the teachers, but the parents as well. All right, so that's kids can't read. That's one challenge. Are there any other trends that you're seeing in the education world that present issues?
Kids can't read. Then we have people, like you said, like me, who are there to support kids who are challenged or, have differences. But then we're met with opposition from parents and family members, for that matter, who, don't want to believe that their children need extra help. They don't want to believe that something is wrong or, that, they just need a little bit extra. And so getting over the denial, if you will, that some people have is a big challenge. And another challenge is, kids are apathetic. They don't want to try. They're not motivated to try. When I went to school, that was my job. My mother was like, yeah, you get A's at school. Because what else are you supposed to do?
That's what you're supposed to do.
That's it. Good job. But now, a lot of times kids aren't receiving that push from their family. And so when they get to school, I'm like, come on, just try. If you don't try, how can you learn? And they're like, I don't care. I don't know. And so, it's difficult from the teacher perspective. It's difficult from a student perspective because if you don't know something, you don't want to try. But, I imagine it's also difficult from a family perspective when you don't know what to do. Not everybody just doesn't care. People care about their kids and they know these things, but oftentimes they don't know what to do. So I try to come in and mitigate that, not knowing what to do and what we can do as a team.
Okay. So that kind of leads me into the first question here. What is the process or of identifying something that there's something different with the child? Mm-hmm. And speak from the classroom perspective first.
Yeah, so typically in a classroom, a general education classroom setting, there's lots of metrics that have to be met. There's lots of numbers that we have to meet. There's lots of standardized testing that has to be done. So teachers are constantly collecting data and analyzing data on every single child in their room. And basing a lot of that off of what the national standards are, because that's what standardized testing does. And so a teacher can, look at the numbers and see a student presenting with certain numbers, but also because we hang out with these kids all day, we typically can know what they can and can't do, and what a typical child of their age is supposed to be able to do. So when we see certain things that just aren't quite clicking the right way, there's instructional practices that can be done to try to help that. But, sometimes it's just not working out. And so then we would have to involve the parent. That looks like a parent-teacher conference or just a phone call. It could be, whatever way a teacher can try to communicate with the parent, just to kind of let them know what's going on with their kid before it takes more formal matters. Okay.
So now, before it goes on to the formal matters, as you put it, is there ever a time where a parent would approach the teacher and say, you know what, I think something's happening here. I can't quite understand why he or she is doing this or not learning this concept. What's the approach at that point?
Yeah, that happens more often than not. I've had many a conversation that's just like, what's wrong with them? I'm like, what do you mean what's wrong with them? They just got here. It's kindergarten. What are you talking about? But, parents who are in tune with their kids will know a lot of times that something is different, especially if this is like the youngest child and they have older kids. They're comparing certain things. And, once a parent comes to us and says, I think something is different, a lot of times, depending on what they're saying and how they're saying it, I'll take the standpoint of, okay, I'll pay attention and just let me see. Because sometimes, a parent can think one thing and it's really not that. So I have to kind of figure it out for myself. But we've also had situations where parents have written like formal letters and said, something is wrong, please evaluate or, take the next steps. So, it's a team approach. I like for it to be a team approach.
Okay. I can only think back to when my son, we were going through that same process with him. And fortunately, he had a teacher, I believe he was in the third grade, who, in so many words, because I understand teachers are limited as to what they can say in these conversations, said that, hey, I'm noticing some things, and this is, if it were me, this is what I would do.
Yeah.
Or this, she couldn't come out and say, this is my recommendation. And we were appreciative of that because she now pointed us in a direction and things that we need to start paying attention to as it resulted to his learning. But not every parent is that receptive. So how do you navigate those waters? Because that's a touchy subject.
It is a touchy subject because nobody wants to think that something is different or wrong with their gift to the world. That's what children are. They're a gift to the world, and nobody wants to think that anything is different with them. And it is touchy. At my school, they call me the parent whisperer because I, for whatever reasons, can get the toughest and the most difficult ones to kind of get on board with us. But it just has a lot to do with like relationship building. As cliche, if there's any educators watching, I know it's very cliche. Relationship building is how you have to get it done. And just being knowledgeable and empathetic. Because again, nobody wants to think something is wrong with their child. And nothing is wrong from my point of view. Like, nothing is wrong. We just need to do a little bit more than maybe we might do for your other kids. And so just, being very soft is how you kind of get around it. And sometimes there are parents who just never come around. And unfortunately, I'm like, okay, well, you'll figure it out eventually. You don't want me to figure it out with you now? That's fine. You'll see later. And we just have to wait. But usually, at least in my experience, I can usually get them to kind of come around.
That's because you're great at what you do. Now, to quote Lil Wayne, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. Let's talk about, and to your point, let's talk about some numbers. The Gwinnett County school system, as I mentioned, is one of the largest in the state of Georgia. 180,000 kids, right? Over 50,000 of the 180,000 kids in the school system receive special ed services. That's almost, a third of the school system? So obviously there are some issues there.
It depends on what you mean by issue, though.
Challenges? There's something going on.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean...
That's a lot of kids.
It is a lot of kids. Services can mean a lot of different things, though. Special ed services, if you will, extends from children with significant learning disabilities or emotional behavior disabilities, but it also extends to kids who just need speech. They may not have any learning disabilities. They just need some articulation, speech support. That's still considered special ed. It also extends to students who are considered gifted because they are receiving a special or an individual plan. They're receiving a special way of learning that meets their needs. And a lot of people don't know that, that your gifted child is special ed as well. So all of that is lumped into that 50, I think it's like 53,000 at this point.
53,000. So if I'm hearing you correctly, even though a child may be testing out or testing up an aptitude, he or she is still considered special needs.
They're receiving a special type of education to meet their needs. So it's still under the umbrella of special education.
Because, the stigma has always been, at least when I was growing up, that if you were in special ed...
Don't say it.
I'm not going to say it, but, their classrooms were not with the rest of the classrooms, and their school buses didn't look like our school buses, and, some of them wore helmets. Anyway, that was wrong. Y'all don't get me. I know, but this is me.
Please.
Okay, so that's interesting to know. Now, once a difficulty, a deficiency, a disability has been identified, what does the engagement and intervention process look like from there for the parents who may have gone through this or are going through it or might need to go through it?
Yeah, so, if a teacher comes to a parent and is like, we're seeing something a little bit different here. This is the type of behavior that they're showing, or this is, what they're having difficulty learning, and we want to start a formalized process that will start with what is called the MTSS process, which is multi-tiered system of support. And so there are 3 different tiers of intervention, basically. So tier 1 is what every student receives, whether that, it looks like remediation, like if there's a student or a group of students who are struggling on a particular thing, we're going to do these few interventions to kind of boost them and get them caught up a little bit, and then we're moving on. So once a student gets past that tier 1 and it shows that they still need support, they go to tier 2, and that's a more intense level of intervention. If they're still not making progress, the data shows that they're still not retaining or whatever it may be, then they move to tier 3 supports, and that's an even more intense support. And by tier 3, the conversation of referral for special education is starting to be talked about. So that's kind of like phase 1 of the process, which has to do with the student, the parent, the teacher, and there may be like instructional coaches or assistant principal involved in that. There's meetings that happen. There should be at least 2 to 3 meetings that happen. They're called SST, which is student support team meetings. And so, it's basically kind of making the parent aware that here's the issue, here's what we're doing about it. That's not working, we're going to do some more. That's not working, now we need to kind of see what's really going on here. Once it leaves the MTSS process, then it comes over to me, which is the special ed side of the world, if you will. And then the referral for special education process starts. And that looks like first it starts with the referral, then within 20 to 25 days, we have to have an evaluation meeting. The parent signs consent, and then we have an evaluation meeting, which the evaluation process takes about 60 days. And through that process, it is the school psychologist is doing psychological testing, intellectual functioning testing. She or he would be testing for emotional disabilities. It kind of depends on where we see the deficit. As a teacher, I do academic achievement testing. So I'm basically saying, like, what do you know how to do, and how does that compare with students of your same age and grade? So what do you know how to do in comparison to what you should know how to do? And then we take all of that data together and we have a meeting to discuss it all, which is where usually the tiers and things come.
The tiers. Is that EIP, 504, IEP? Is that where that comes in, or we?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not quite. Okay, so those things, they're kind of bubbles that kind of stem from the same world, if you will. Okay. Once we do the evaluation and come to that meeting, that's when it's basically a 2 to 2.5 hour long meeting where we say everything that your child can't do. And that's why I say that's where the tears come, because who wants to sit for 2 hours and listen to what their child can't do? And I've literally had people say, I don't want to hear this. I know what they can't do. I don't want to hear this. And it's like, well, legally I have to tell you, like out loud. I have to tell you and show you what it is. And some people understanding, like, yep, you're totally right. Other people, they don't really care to hear it, but a lot of times by that point, I've helped them reach the point of, okay, I know this is necessary and my kid needs help. Let me get them help. After that, if we find them eligible for services, or we find them eligible as a student with a disability, then in the next 30 days, I will write an IEP, which is an individual education plan. Or sometimes I can write a 504 plan. So that's kind of, there's different stems of services that one can receive.
Let me ask you this, and we'll get back to this EIP versus IEP and 504. Can you, or without divulging any, obvious personal details, can you give us an extreme case that you've worked, the names and have been changed to protect the innocent or guilty? Extreme cases,
I have a lot of,
you're 6 years deep, so I know you got them.
Right, and this year has been a lot of them all at once.
Right. And I'm sorry, you work the school you work at is a Title I school, correct? All right. So before you get into your response, let's just explain to the listening public what identifies a school as a Title I to kind of paint the whole picture.
So the simplest way I can explain it is Title I basically means that a large percentage of the students at that school's parents are below the poverty line of income. We like to say Title I is not how you learn, it's how you eat. Because essentially it means that majority of the kids in the building are receiving free or reduced lunch. That's pretty much all Title I really means. It's, how these kids eat, it's how they, a lot of times it's how they present at school because they're coming from poverty. And that can be a whole other episode.
That is a whole
of what that means.
Because that affects how they learn. If they're not coming to school adequately equipped to learn, if that means a good breakfast, then, there's an issue. Okay, so I got off track here. But can you speak to an extreme case?
Let me pick a couple, or one. One extreme case was a few years ago. We had a student come from Florida, and I saw the child walk in. I was like, oh, we're about to get a new student. And they did not march him to my room. They marched him down the hall to another general education room, and I was real confused. Long story short, this child presented with pretty significant autism. He was nonverbal and had not been to school, or had been to school for a few months, but the parents were like, this isn't working out, and somebody told them to go to Gwinnett County because they can help your child. They're good at working with kids like yours.
They said, go see Lindsey Thomas.
Basically, I'm pretty sure that's how it happened. And, long story short, I get this kid. Eventually, he does get moved to my room for safety purposes because he was not able to maintain himself in a room with 25 other kindergartners with his type of disability.
Wait, you're picking on him? What, like safety purposes? What?
Well, he climbing on things, throwing things, hitting kids. Yeah.
All right.
Because he didn't know how to be in a classroom like that. And the way his disability was set up, he couldn't even manage that much sensory input in that type of classroom.
Had he been in a different classroom environment prior to coming to your school, to your class?
He was in the other state, but they really didn't want to tell us a lot about that. But what it sounded like is that he was at a gen ed, like in a gen ed classroom, and the parents thought that he couldn't speak because his classmates spoke Spanish and English. His classmates were bilingual, and they were like, well, he's not talking because they speak Spanish. And it's like, well, okay, sure. So we kind of moved past that.
Okay.
Right. Convince the parents, like, let us help him. He needs help. Let us do the things. I've been through that pretty easily, working with the mom. But once it got time for, like, let's have this meeting, let's discuss all of the things, the father, that's when he kind of stepped in, and he didn't shut everything down, but he was just not easy to work with. He was not willing to admit that his son needed more help than he thought. He just thought, oh, he just needs to learn how to talk a little bit. And it's like, no, he needs a lot more than that. We eventually got through it, and, he kind of complied, if you will, because otherwise, what was he going to do? And so we, did what we could do, got the child the help he needed, got him in a class where he could be his best self, and hopefully he is being his best self.
Okay. Now, in our conversations, our separate conversations, I hear you talk about children arriving to your school. Was it this year that you received a student that was not potty trained?
Several, yes.
Time out.
I've potty trained 3 kids this school year. Or I've supported people in potty training 3 children this school year. How old were these children? 2 of them were kindergarten age. 1 of them was 8. 8
years old and not potty trained.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's another extreme case, coming from a neglectful background, never been to school,
But all of which, these are circumstances that require a special ed program to be, or interventions to be initiated.
Yeah, sure. Because
it's not just always learning. development.
Right. These are kids with very significant disabilities. Not just like this kid. It's not just because he was neglected that he wasn't potty trained and didn't speak or do things like that. It's because he had a very significant disability. So that's the reason why he couldn't learn how to do those things like, a typical child would learn how to do it. So even if he showed up to us at 4 or 5, we still would have done all of the same things and the outcome would have still been relatively similar.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So now we've identified some extreme cases. And so now we're moving on to, is it time? What comes next? Is it time to write out the EIP and the...
Yes. So once the IEP is written, that's when the child starts receiving federally mandated special education services, and that can look several different ways. It doesn't always mean that they're in a special class or anything like that. It really just depends on what they need, because an IEP is individual education plan, so it's based solely on what does this one particular child need to be successful in whatever education setting that is necessary.
So, for instance, again, going back to our personal experience with our son, they offered, I think part of his plan was if he needs extra time to complete assignments or quizzes or tests, if he needs to do that in a quiet environment, is that what falls into an IEP?
Yes, that can fall into an IEP. An IEP it lays out what accommodations you need. So an accommodation can be extended time when taking a test or doing a harder assignment. It can be testing in a small group, which would be like going into a quieter room with less kids in it. It can be preferential seating, which means I need this child to sit close to the front so they can pay attention or see or hear, or I need them to sit in a corner by themselves so that they're not distracted. So it can just be anything that is needed. But a student can receive accommodations without an IEP. So an IEP is like, I don't want to say an extreme case, but an IEP is kind of like the last method of intervention, how we supply interventions, if you will. But a student can still receive accommodations without going that far. So let's say, for example, ADHD, that's a real big buzz in the world right now, and a lot of our kids are challenged with that. But you can have an ADHD diagnosis or just have a child that is showing symptoms of ADHD. That doesn't necessarily mean they need an IEP and they need to be in a special class or they even need to see me ever. They can receive accommodations in other ways, which would look like the 504 that you were talking about. A 504 is really just a plan for accommodation. So that can be for a student that has ADHD. That can be for a student that has another health impairment. I've written 504s for students who have other health impairments. Like I have a student who has sickle cell and he's in the hospital a lot. So he has a 504 that says, if he has to be out, there's no like repercussions for him missing so many days of school, or if he needs to have support at the hospital or if he has to stay home for some amount of time, he can receive that type of support. So a 504 is accommodations pretty much. You mentioned EIP. EIP is early intervention program. And so that is when we try to catch kids in kindergarten and first grade and second grade who are showing little signs of being behind a little bit, or, they just need a little extra push more so than what can be done inside the classroom. And so they'll get pulled and given a little bit of extra support. That usually happens way before the MTSS process, because it's like, we try to give them as much as we can before we start doing formal things. So kids can get support all throughout in different ways. It just depends on what they need.
Okay. I'm about to rattle the tree, shake the tree a little bit here. Yeah, let's sip on this one because we're getting ready to go somewhere.
To Atlanta.
ATL, shall we? I know my personal answer to this question, but I want to get your professional answer.
Okay. Oh, Lord.
Is there a definitive line or difference between school systems that have resources versus those school systems that don't? And it may be a result of leadership. We mentioned the leadership change in the Gwinnett County School Superintendent. do those look different? I guess I'm gonna name names since I'm saying Gwinnett County. Your school system versus like a Johns Creek or North Fulton.
So
tell it like it is.
So I'm biased or whatever. I believe my school system does special ed the best.
Okay.
I have friends who teach in other places, in other states, in other countries, and nobody's doing special ed the way we're doing it over here.
Is that because you have 53,000 children on plans?
It could be.
Okay.
I mean, but also to that point, we have that many kids on plans because we're identifying kids and we're giving them the support that they need. So, where does the number really lie? Is it in the fact that there's so many over here, or is it in the fact that we're catching kids when they need to be caught versus just letting them
go through the system? That's kind of where I was going. Is there such a thing where, again, just keeping it a buck, teachers, schools, school systems kind of push kids through or float them through just because they, one, don't want to identify the problem or don't want to take that time to address the needs of that individual child? Because, again, speaking from personal experience, I feel like there are school systems that excel. If you look at their numbers and their stats on paper, wow, this is one of the top rated school systems in the state. We won't name any names, even though I just did. And so parents rush to get their kids into that system. And again, I can't emphasize enough how personal this is for us, but we were in one of those school systems with our children. And just because we had one child who happens to be our child in the classroom that wasn't performing like the rest of the kids, we felt like they were throwing accommodations unnecessarily or trying to create a excuse as to why they didn't engage the way they did. Is that a thing? Is that something that parents need to look out for?
It is. I implore parents, please advocate for your kids. Know your children, engage with your children, engage with their schools, know their teachers, talk to their teachers, because teachers are people. People are imperfect. Teachers are going to ride for the kids that they like the best. And they like the kids whose parents, kind of show up for them. But also, you have to make these people do their job. It is what it is. Like, you have to make them do their job. And that's me too. I'm like, yes, check me. Make sure I'm doing the things that I said I was going to do for your child, because we have a lot going on. So you have to make these people do their jobs. And it is an issue just across education in all spaces, because teaching is a very overwhelming job for various reasons. That could be another episode too. So you just have to pay attention and make the people do their jobs. And, to your point, because I was there, there are some systems who don't necessarily want to deal with children who are different. And that could be different because they are culturally different. That could be different because their language is different, or because they learn differently. I've come across kids where I'm like, you don't have a learning disability. You just needed to be taught in the way that you learn. And that might not have been the way that Becky and Chase learned, but, you need to be taught your way and, make the people do their job. Make them differentiate. Hold them accountable.
Okay. Just wanted to get your professional opinion on that. Let's talk about invisible disabilities, things that we don't see, identifiers and markers. Take us down that road.
Yeah, so when people think of special ed, like you mentioned earlier, wearing a helmet or whatever, like people think of special ed looking a certain type of way, or people who have special needs, they look and sound and function a certain type of way, which is a thing, sure. But there are so many more individuals in the world who have differences and who, may someone is considered having a special need that we don't even see. Like ADHD is one of those. Some people think, oh, he can't sit down. Something wrong with him. He can't sit down. It's like his body literally he can't regulate. His brain is moving so fast that he can't listen to this lesson, process it, and retain it because his brain doesn't allow it. But nobody would know that because that doesn't look like somebody that should ride the small bus. Or, even just kids with dyslexia. What does that look like? What does dyslexia look like?
Dyslexia, there are many forms of dyslexia, I've come to learn. It's not just transposing letters and numbers. It's comprehension, reading comprehension, or
all of it together. It can. Most people recognize it initially as the D's and the B's, the P's and the Q's, and if you're doing that by third grade, something is wrong. But it can also mean just the words, once they hit your brain, they process backwards. So you can't really understand what you're reading because the words don't make sense in order. But what does that look like to a person on the outside? You wouldn't ever know that somebody has dyslexia if they didn't tell you. But those are things, and those are part of the 13 disability categories that we look for. It's a specific learning disability, and more people in the world than not have specific learning disabilities, undiagnosed really, but hopefully we can get them diagnosed, but undiagnosed learning disabilities. And so we say all these children can't read, but part of it is because they have undiagnosed disabilities. And you're working with some of those people every day.
There are plenty of adults who need accommodations.
Right, exactly.
At their job. I wouldn't mind a few, but it's neither here nor there. So, okay, now what's the approach in the classroom setting when you see these invisible disabilities?
Typically, like if they are identified, so if a student is receiving accommodations, whether it's 504 or IEP, that can look different ways. As a special ed teacher, that most often looks like me coming into a gen ed classroom and supporting the students' needs, whatever they may be. It could be when the teacher is writing something on the board, I'll write it on their table next to them, because actually looking at your paper and looking up at a board and copying things down is an actual processing skill. Some kids, that's difficult. They can't look up there and put it down here and it's the same. It's a brain process. But if I put it right next to you, you can do that because it's closer. It can look like me highlighting things for them or teaching them the skills of like how to read a paragraph and pick out the key points. It just looks like intense instructional practices within the classroom that the teacher may be doing on a broad scale, but I'm bringing it in, to more individualized space for that child based on what I know that they need. And that could mean sometimes, because we're talking about learning disabilities, but I work with behavior too. So that could sometimes mean me coming over going, pay attention. Or you need to take a break, go take a break. Because I'm paying attention to them being frustrated or, just being overwhelmed with the information. They need to like reset a little bit.
Okay. Is that why the fidget spinners were so popular when they came out? Because the kids with attention? Yeah.
It became a toy at some point, but fidgets are a thing. Like I have some kids where I'll just slightly hand them something because I see them getting a little, weird or whatever. So yeah, it could look so many different ways. It could also look like a student coming out of the gen ed classroom and going to a smaller classroom with a special ed teacher and learning in a smaller group. They're doing all the same things. It's 5 of us instead of 25 of us now. Or they just take their test outside of the room.
Interesting.
They get candy from me at the end of the day because they behaved themselves all day. Like, it could be lots of things.
Okay. Moving right along, we'll take a small pause for the cause. So whether you have aspirations of being an entrepreneur, a creative visionary, or just someone who loves the energy and networking of Atlanta, you are in the right place. You've landed on the right podcast, so make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and share to the 404 Effect with an A, available wherever you get your podcasts. That's a wrap on this episode of the 404 Effect. Big thanks to our guests for sharing their insight and stories, showing us once again why Atlanta isn't just a city. It's a movement that we are all a part of. I know we took a deep dive and covered a lot, and if today's conversation sparked something in you, keep that energy going and build off of it. Share it, talk about it, and most importantly, take action, because the people shaping this city aren't just watching from the sidelines. They're in the game and making major moves doing it. Stay locked in for the next episode where we bring you more of Atlanta's sharpest minds and boldest voices. Until then, keep pushing, keep